It's episode 4 and I'm happy because I can finally get stuck into some real work. The goal of this episode is to show the cylinder head being removed from the engine. You might have already noticed that the engine has been relieved of a few minor parts since episode 2, so now you can really see it starting to look more like a conventional 4-cylinder and just how small it really is. As already stated, the engine has covered 105,000 miles, so it's going to be fully rebuilt, which means I don't have to be super careful about dropping stuff and so on. However, I will try and pretend like I'm doing this job properly. First job I want to do is turn the crank so all the pistons are level. To make hand cranking easier, first remove the spark plugs. I feel having all the pistons level will help later on when it comes to removing the connecting rods from the crankshaft. I don't see any reason to have the crank in any other position. Once done, a quick vacuum out of the plug wells to remove any dirt. The crank can easily be turned by attaching a socket to the bolt that secures the auxiliary drive belt pulley. Cranking should be done in a clockwise direction. There is a groove cut into the pulley which, when used with this marker plate, shows the crank angle. Turning the crank so the groove lines up with the 0 denotes that pistons 1 and 4 are at the top of their stroke, so advancing the rotation by 90 degrees should level the pistons. A simple check can be made by inserting equal length balsa wood rods into the spark plug holes to prove this is the case. Once the pistons are level, the timing belt can be removed. First, the auxiliary belt pulley needs to come off. Undoing the bolt normally would cause the engine to rotate backwards, so this is the perfect time to show off my new impact driver. Cool, that was on there tight. In order to remove the pulley, I'm going to reinsert the bolt back in without the conical washer so that my extractor tool has something to push against. This is the tool I made for taking the pulley off. This tool simply slips over the pulley and the centre bolt is wound against the bolt I just replaced. You could use a bearing puller, but they tend to make a mess and slide off easily. Also, try using one when the engine is still in the car and you're doing a cam belt change. You'll see exactly what I mean. The pulley can often be really stuck in place, but using my gizmo, look how easy it comes off. Lastly, this bolt is now taken off again. Now the tensioner needs to be slackened. As I'm taking the tensioner off, so this nut is completely removed. Sometimes the tensioner will rotate by hand, but this one won't, so a 19mm wrench is used to detension the belt. Now the belt is slack, it can be removed. To remove the tensioner, it has to be rotated so it can pass over the crank angle plate and be wiggled free. Coming with it is the hefty air conditioning pump bracket. I don't need this ever again, so it's a nice bit of weight saving. The cam covers are removed next. Very easy, just 3 button head screws that hold each one in place. There are tabs at the end of each of the castings that can gently be prised against to break the gasket seal. Inside you can see the camshafts and cam followers. The intake side is exactly the same, except that you have a nice carry handle included. Here is the last view of the camshaft housings in place before removing them from the head. In order to remove the camshaft housings, these hex socket plugs need to be taken off to gain access to the Torx bolts underneath. Yes, I did loosen them whilst off camera because they were really stuck fast. The housings are held on by 8 Torx head bolts and 2 nuts on each. Fixings must gradually be released in a diagonal inward pattern. I'm not going to show this because it took a fair while and it's boring, so I'll skip ahead to the point where I got my fingers trapped instead. Point to note, I found the valve spring tension against the camshaft to be more than I anticipated. As you can see, it trapped my fingers as the bolts on one end came loose. If you were being brazen here, the force of the valve springs could easily eject the camshaft housing off its seat, causing it to fall if you were not careful. Finally, this thing comes off. I'm definitely going to rethink how I do this in the future to make things easier. One small thing I forgot on the exhaust side is that before taking the cam housing off, it's a good idea to fit magnets onto each of the cam followers so that the shims underneath don't go flying everywhere. As it happens, that did not occur, but it's good practice if you aren't replacing everything like I am. The intake housing is exactly the same, except this is where I can tell that someone has been at the engine before me, as they've nicely fitted 2 different types of Torx head bolts just to make things complicated. The second housing is removed and now we're ready to take the head off. A quick flyover over the tops of the valve gear. I'm so glad this isn't a V12. Before starting work, I labelled each of the fastener positions with a paint pen, so I got the unbolting sequence correct. This is when I spotted the rusty low-grade nylock nut. I don't think this is a problem as it's right in the corner, but again it shows someone has had a play with the engine at some point and it's just bad workmanship. The aluminium head has been through hundreds of hot-cold heat cycles whilst bolted down, so it's imperative that the fasteners are removed progressively and in a diagonal fashion as shown, to allow the stress within the head to relax evenly. Failure to do this could cause excessive warping and possibly render the head completely unusable for future use. Replacement would likely cost 4 figures. I'm not against the clock here, so I'm going to release the head in a very similar way to how it should be fitted. Each fastener is released roughly 20 degrees, then 45 degrees, and then 90 degrees before completely removing. I won't bore you with the entire sequence, but it is the most important part of this job. At last the head is ready to be removed. I was pleasantly surprised to find out it came off with almost no resistance. Oop, mind your eyes on the studs. A quick check to see if there are any trapped fluids. Nope, we're all good, so now let's transfer it to the bench. The head gasket and pistons are inspected just in case there's any telltale signs of previous problems. Apart from a few marks on piston 1, everything seems okay to me. Without taking all the valves off, it's impossible to tell what condition the critical parts are in the head, but here's a flyby anyway. So now the head is off, what's next? The valves need to come off and then the head can be checked for warping and overall flatness. From there I can make an assessment on whether it's a keeper or not. Then it is on to the other half of the engine and stripping down the crank housing and taking the pistons out. Once I have a plan for the rebuild, you'll be the first to know, but it's looking good and I'm really pleased with the initial conversations I've had. As always, thank you for your time and the incredibly kind feedback I've received for this project. There is so much more to come.